A broader look now at the nuclear threat and the U.S. response. We spoke to Aaron David Miller. He's a former State Department advisor, negotiator, and analyst in Republican and Democratic administrations. He's now a vice president and director of the Middle East program at the Wilson Center in Washington, D.C. First, I'd like to ask you what your assessment is of the risk of a nuclear attack.
A nuclear attack by North Korea against Japan, South Korea, or the United States, I think, and therein lies, I think, the focus of everyone's worries and concerns. I think the possibility, and remember, life's divided into possibilities and probabilities. I think that the probability of an attack launched by the North Korean regime against the United States, the continental United States, Guam, or any of our allies is quite low. The fact that I would even ascribe low to the probability factor, however, is even worrisome to me, because what I would like to have said is it's essentially non-existent. And I don't think in the world of black swans in which we live, both on the domestic and the foreign policy side, that it's possible to basically rule out or eliminate. I discussed it as a probability, the possibility of such an occurrence. I think you have the potential of a perfect storm. You have a North Korean regime that, for reasons that driven by its profound insecurity and its own sense of entitlement and grandiosity, has developed probably a dozen or so nuclear weapons, as in the prospects of developing a launch capacity, which at some point, I think the North Koreans are probably farther away than we think with regard to developing a ballistic ICBM that could survive re-entry and actually strike the United States, but they will get there. You have an American administration and a president who has created a degree of urgency, which isn't bad, but a kind of non-strategic urgency, which has generated a series of statements in tweets and public statements by the president that has not only mocked and taunted Kim Jong-Un, but has personalized this in a way that most North Korean analysts have never seen before.
You've argued in some of the things that you've written that President Trump's threats in response, yes, they've personalized it, but when he talks about fire and fury, you said that's not credible. Why is it not credible from the United States point of view?
Well, it's not credible if you're going to act on the threat. Because the question is, once you examine the realities of what a unilateral American military strike would look like, you get off into the realm of nightmarish contingencies and possibilities.
And those are?
Any strike against North Korea, it seems to me, for example, an effort to take out a North Korean missile launch, to hit sovereign North Korean territory, is going to generate a response by the regime that could trigger an escalation on the Korean Peninsula that could lead to scores, if not hundreds of thousands, of deaths. And we're not even talking necessarily nuclear. We're talking about a high trajectory rocket capacity. We're talking about chemical, biological weapons, which the North Koreans have. And all of this would be directed at vulnerable targets, most likely South Korea and American forces and several 100,000 American civilians in Seoul, not to mention Seoul itself. So you'd have to, we can threaten, the president can use terms like locked and loaded, fire and fury. At the UN, he talked about totally destroying North Korea. But not only, it seems to me, is this rhetoric unhelpful is an understatement. And I'm not a military planner, But the people around him, MMT&K, Mattis, McMaster, Kelly, Tillerson. Tillerson's not a military expert, but I think he would counsel patience and at some point negotiations he has undercut by the president while he was doing it. They would argue that there is no credible, rational military option that won't risk this sort of nightmarish escalation and or achieve American objectives. And that is the key issue in the end. What is the American objective?
Okay, can you answer that for me?
Well, if you listen to the administration's rhetoric, it is denuclearization. But the odds of stripping Kim Jong-Un's nukes from him without a collapse of the regime, I think, are slim to none. I think the only rational focus, the rational objective would be perhaps over time, and when I say over time, I think we're talking decades, denuclearization. But for the moment, working out a set of ground rules through military-to-military exchanges that could manage miscommunication and mistakes on one hand, and then looking to freeze North Korea's both its nuclear testing and its missile production in exchange for counter confidence building measures on the part of the United States, most likely involving military exercises with the South Koreans and maybe over time sanctions relief.
Put Iran into the picture now, because the European Union now is arguing that because President Trump refused to certify the nuclear agreement with Iran, that in some fashion it would affect negatively any attempt to try to have some negotiation with North Korea. Do you agree with that assessment?
Well, you'd have to argue that if Kim is interested in talking, and frankly, right now I don't think he is. I think he wants to come to the table with maximum leverage, and that would mean having the capacity, demonstrated capacity, or at least to convince us that he could actually launch a nuke on an ICBM that would actually hit the continental United States. I don't think he's interested in talking. But if he were, and you're sitting in Pyongyang, I think the conclusion you would reach is not only is the United States untrustworthy and unable to keep its commitments. It'd be one thing if the Iranians were routinely and comprehensively violating this JCPOA, this nuclear agreement. But they're not. So if you were Kim, you're looking at this, assuming he wanted to talk, and it's still a big assumption, you'd look at this and say, A, the U.S. isn't trustworthy, and B, why am I even considering the possibility of diplomacy if, in fact, one president can commit to something, an international agreement ensconced in a UN Security Council resolution, and the next president basically hasn't yet, but is threatening to impose additional hoops through which I'm going to have to jump. Why should I even bother with this? So yes, I think there is a relationship between any effort to walk away from the JCPOA, a closed nuclear file, I might add, however imperfect, and it is imperfect, the agreement, when we have an open nuclear file in North Korea that we can't manage.
I have one final question, and I want to take it a little bit beyond these two countries, which are the focus of so much attention. When you talk about the untrustworthiness of the United States, there are other nuclear nations out there. Russia, China, India, Pakistan. Does this untrustworthiness on this file have broader implications beyond these two immediate headlines?
I mean, look, you've got the 5 permanent members of the Security Council, right? They've all had nuclear weapons now for 60 plus years. Only once in October 1962 have we come close to an nuclear exchange between the United States and the former Soviet Union. Then you have an additional number of countries, Pakistan, India, North Korea, and Israel. So you got 9 countries, which frankly in 70 years, since the U.S. used atomic weapons against Japan, I mean, is a small number of nuclear countries. And I think the danger here with the North Korean situation is that if it drags on and there's no bombing, there's no negotiation, but you end up with Kim's arsenal increasing and the sophistication of his ballistic missile technology reach increasing, I think there's going to be growing pressure on South Korea and Japan to figure out a way to acquire nuclear weapons. Now, there are all kinds of constraints and counter-arguments as to why that might not happen. But we saw it with India and Pakistan. The dance produces a counter dance. And it increases the likelihood that there will be additional countries that will join the nuclear club.
Mr. Miller, I thank you very much for your expertise and your insight on this.
Thank you so much.